Good day. This video, as all my recent videos have been for most months now, except the odd one on Taiwan and the French elections, is going to be once more about the conflict in Ukraine. And again, I don't make any apology about this because ultimately this is the focal point of the world crisis. What happens in this conflict, in this armed conflict in Ukraine, will ultimately decide that crisis. We have, as I'm going to discuss later in the program, growing economic problems in Europe, growing concerns from people like Henry Kissinger, diplomatic stalemate, crisis, tensions rising in Taiwan, tensions rising in the Middle East, but ultimately the key decision, the event that will decide which direction this world crisis takes will be the conflict in Ukraine. Now, before I press on further, there's just one specific point I want to make about this, and that is about war aims. Now, I suspect that Russian war aims in Ukraine have been an evolving thing. I think that when President Putin launched his special operation in February, I think he was hoping, this is my own view, I think he was hoping at that time that there would be a negotiated settlement with the Ukrainian government. And he, after all, for the day after the special operation was launched, he actually suspended it, a fact which people often forget when President Zelensky seemed to be open to negotiations. And as we know, most of March was taken up with negotiations alongside the fighting. And in Istanbul at the end of March, we came very close to an agreement. And perhaps it's useful to go back and consider what Russian demands at that point were. Russian demands at that point were still that Ukraine recognize Crimea as part of Russia, that Ukraine recognize Donbass, the two republics of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, as independent, that Ukraine make various provisions for the protection, as Russia saw it, of the rights of Russian speakers in Ukraine itself, that it takes steps to bring to purge itself of the followers of that ideology, which I'm not going to name, but which has its origins in Europe in the interwar period and is particularly associated with Germany, the Germany of that time. And last but not least, that Ukraine commit to neutral status, that it refuse to join, that it give up its project of joining NATO. And these were demands, Russian demands, which in my opinion, Ukraine could have accepted in March. It seemed to come very close to accepting in March in the talks in Istanbul, and which might have provided a framework for some kind of a peace agreement. Well, I think that today that is all history. I think that now Russia is going to demand a great deal more. It's going to demand, at the very least, that Ukraine not only accept the loss of Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, but that it accept the loss of the land corridor linking Russia to Crimea, Kherson region and Zaporozhye. And as I'm going to discuss further in this program, I suspect that Russian war aims have extended even beyond that now. But this is I'm going to discuss further and later. But perhaps a more interesting question in some ways is not Russian war aims in Ukraine, which, as I said, they're evolving. You can work out to some extent what the ultimate Russian objectives in Ukraine are. It is what Western war aims are. And the closest we've had to that apart from rhetorical poses like Boris Johnson's that Russia must fail and be seen to fail, and demands that Ukraine be supported until it's achieved final victory, which will include the complete reincorporation of Donbass and Crimea into Ukrainian territory, something which I, by the way, increasingly doubt that any Western government seriously believes. But the closest we have come to a real expression of Western war aims in Ukraine are in that article, that op-ed by President Biden in the New York Times, in which he spoke about positioning Ukraine in a stronger position in eventual negotiations. But to what end exactly? And in General Lloyd Austin's famous comment, which I suspect is the key war aim now, or at least the rationalization of the war now, in terms of what the United States is trying to do, which is to weaken Russia. And the idea seems to be to create a quagmire for Russia in Ukraine, an indefinite war of attrition for Russia in Ukraine, to cause the Russians to suffer enormous losses of men and materials, and to weaken the Russian economy and to weaken Russia geopolitically, so as ultimately to erase Russia from the map as a serious geopolitical challenger to the United States. Now, there is, it seems to me, a fundamental problem with this whole objective. And it is one which, as we're going to see, as I discuss more matters in this video, but also if we look back through history, that a policy of weakening Russia can only be successful if Russia loses the war in Ukraine. The effect of victorious wars, even costly and prolonged victorious wars, is, in terms of historical precedent, not to weaken the victor, but to strengthen the victor. Let me give one example out of US history. The United States, when the Civil War started in 1861, many people in the United States, in the northern states, expected a quick and victorious war. Instead, they ended up in a long, prolonged slog, in a tough and bloody war of attrition, one which cost hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides, by the way. But at the end of that war, despite all the losses in men and machines and in treasure, most people would agree that the United States emerged a much more powerful country than when it went in. And it didn't just emerge a more powerful country, it emerged as a country on a trajectory which by the mid-20th century would make it indisputably the most powerful country in the world. So there's a good example of a war of attrition which, far from weakening the victor, ended up strengthening the victor, even after the all those losses of men and machines and treasure that the United States experienced over the course of that long war. I called it the Civil War. I appreciate that there are many Americans who still refer to it as the war between the states. I'm not entering into the politics of the war. I'm simply making the point that a war of attrition can actually end up strengthening a winner, usually ends up strengthening the winner rather than weakening them at least in geopolitical terms. And there are so many examples of this in history. I mean, if we go all the way back to the history of the Roman Republic, for example, its long wars with Carthage, also very difficult, very bloody, very prolonged. Well, at the end of them, Rome emerged as the undisputed global power in the Mediterranean world. And you could go more further, closer still, Britain's wars against France in the 18th and early 19th centuries. Again, the British ended up expending vast amounts of material and manpower, but eventually they came out the winner of those wars. And again, the 19th century was a period of enormous British power. And perhaps the bloodiest, most prolonged and difficult war of attrition of the war, the Second World War, as it applies to the Eastern Front. Well, the Soviet Union went into the Second World War, admittedly a powerful country, but hardly the most powerful, and it came out of that war as a superpower. Now, I'm not predicting that this is going to be the outcome of the Ukraine war. And I'm not predicting either that I'm not saying either that the Russians, when they started this war, had the expectations that many people had, that it would be a short, victorious war. But what I am saying is that if the calculus in Washington was that a prolonged war in Ukraine would weaken Russia, then they need to consider that history suggests, on the contrary, that if Russia wins, it will not weaken Russia, it could actually make it much stronger. And wars of attrition work in strange ways. They can strengthen governmental systems, they can modernize and restructure economies, they can lead to new diplomatic alliances and new trade routes. They can streamline bureaucracies. And we can see all of those things happening in Russia today, just as we can see the Russian military learning how to fight a conventional war of a kind that it has not had to fight since it achieved victory in that war in Europe all those years ago, back in 1945. So I think that the United States needs to consider very carefully whether what it is actually doing isn't weakening Russia, but rather strengthening Russia. And I say that because, as I said, wars of attrition weaken losers and can strengthen winners. And at the moment, and in fact, on any foreseeable trajectory, barring lunatic ideas like the United States getting directly involved in the war, engaging Russia in some kind of nuclear exchange, or Simon Tisdale's bizarre ideas in The Guardian, which I discussed in my previous program, about, overthrowing or getting rid of, or well, whatever it was that he was talking about, getting rid of President Putin. Barring those kind of extreme outcomes, it doesn't seem now as if there's any conceivable way in which Russia can lose this war. Now, let us look at the situation on the ground in Ukraine. And here I am going to say that when I did my program yesterday, because I've been away in Greece, I've not been able to follow events as closely as I have done up till, my travel to Greece. So I, to some extent, lost touch with some of the situation on the ground. Well, I've now looked at the situation on the ground, and I'm going to say a few things. Firstly, it seems that the situation, the Ukrainian position in Donbass, is becoming even weaker than I had realized. It seems that the Russians are now advancing on every possible front in Donbass. They're also apparently making significant inroads in closer to the city of Zaporozhye, which, by the way, makes it easier to understand these Ukrainian artillery strikes on the Zaporozhye nuclear power station. It seems, for example, that the Russians, or at least the Russian allied forces, have achieved some kind of a breakthrough towards the important southern Donbass city of Ugleda or Vugleda, depending on how you pronounce it. And that has been another linchpin of Ukrainian lines, fortified lines, linking the southern group of forces, the Ukrainian southern group of forces, to the city of Zaporozhye, this big industrial city in Zaporozhye region, close to the Dnieper River, but on the east side of the Dnieper River, which I said it could very well turn out to be a Russian objective before very long. And of course, if Ugleda falls, then the communications, the resupply of that southern force, which is already coming under terrible pressure with the loss of Persky, its communications, its resupplies start to become severely jeopardized. And in fact, they could become untenable. And we could even start to see something like an encirclement operation for these forces, in these Ukrainian forces, this Ukrainian group of forces opposite Donetsk city, which has been one of the major fortified areas in Donbass. We could even start to see that begin to emerge. But we're also perhaps starting to see the beginnings, in fact, it's more than the beginnings, of an encirclement, or at least some kind of an envelopment of Bakhmut, the other linchpin of the Ukrainian defenses in Donbass. And that's, of course, further north. And we've learnt that a whole string of small towns and settlements around Bakhmut have now been falling under Russian control. There was more reports yesterday of more of these places and settlements now starting to fall. And already it looks like the Russians, who are physically already present in Bakhmut along the Patrice Lumumba Avenue, but it seems that the Russians now have a kind of horseshoe-shaped control around Bakhmut from the north, the east and the south. They're pressing on Bakhmut from all directions, having already penetrated fairly deep into Bakhmut, but more in its industrial than residential areas along the Patrice Lumumba highway. And of course, that draws Ukrainian troops to these sort of front lines. That creates more complications, by the way, for resupplying. Now, most of the supply lines to Bakhmut come from the west, so they're not yet cut off. But with the Russians achieving this sort of crescent-shaped encirclement or envelopment of Bakhmut, their artillery can start to interfere with those supply lines and perhaps bring them ever closer to the point where Bakhmut itself becomes encircled. Now, I'm not saying that that's the Russian objective. Maybe the objective is to simply storm Bakhmut from the east or the north and the south, maybe a triple attack on Bakhmut. As I said, I'm not familiar with the lineup of forces in Bakhmut. I'm not familiar with how many Ukrainian troops are in Bakhmut or how strong the fortifications in Bakhmut are. I'm not also, as I've said many times, a military person anyway, so I'm not the best person to judge how the Russians are going to take Bakhmut. But Bakhmut, the position in Bakhmut, the Ukrainian position in Bakhmut now looks extremely precarious. And the day before yesterday, the day before I came to London, the day before I started traveling to London, I read reports that the Russians, or at least Russian allied forces, had captured half of Soledar. Well, I can't confirm that still, But there's no doubt at all that the pressure on Solidar, or Ukrainian forces in Solidar, is growing all the time. And again, it looks as if that particular suburb, as it really should be understood at Bakhmut, is coming under increasing pressure. And further north, the situation for Ukraine looks bad as well, because it seems that as the Ukrainian lines in the south of Donetsk region are starting to crack apart, the Russians have been advancing towards Siversk again. Now, the Russians made several attempts, so advances towards Siversk shortly after Lysychansk fell at the end of, in July, but and in fact, the officials of the Lugansk People's Republic twice wrongly reported that Siversk had been largely captured by the Russians. That never actually happened, and it seems that there was never any real Russian attempt to capture Siversk. But these latest advances towards Siversk look more incremental, look more methodical. It's not a cavalry charge to try to take Siversk through some sort of coup de main, which perhaps those other operations were, but rather a serious attempt this time to envelop and capture Siversk, destroying the Ukrainian front lines there as well. So all of this is very bad for Ukraine, but we now are seeing that there is another major problem for the Ukrainian military, and that's around Kharkov. Now, it seems that the Russians have captured an important town called Udy, which is to the northwest of Kharkov, and they're also making advances to the southwest of Kharkov. They're battling to capture various towns and small settlements to the southwest of Kharkov. And the military summary channel, and I think on this, I'm sure that it's absolutely correct. It's often, as I said, it's probably the go-to place if you really want to get an overall sense of what is actually happening on the battlefields. The military summary channel is suggesting that these are the opening stages for a Russian plan for the encirclement of Kharkov. Now, the military summary channel says that this has to be completed before the winter. I'm not sure why. By the way, I'm not sure why Russian military is supposed to be incapable of operating in this territory in winter. I would have thought that the Russians, who carried out many offensives during the Second World War on their territory in winter, would be able to continue offensives in winter if that is their objective. But anyway, it seems that the military summary channel seems to think that it's important for the Russians to encircle Kharkov before the winter closes in. Perhaps that's true, possibly it's not, but one way or the other, it does seem as if the Russians are working towards an encirclement of Kharkov. And the way they're doing it suggests to me that this is in earnest. I don't think this is a feint. I don't think this is intended to draw the Ukrainians away from other battlefields. So I think that this is a genuine long-term or medium-term plan to encircle Kharkov before ultimately storming Kharkov. And again, the military summary channel seems to believe that it would be impossible or very difficult or massively costly in terms of lives for the Russians to simply storm Kharkov, that they would have to wait until the Ukrainian forces in Kharkov were weakened to the point of no longer being able to offer effective resistance before the Russians did launch a storming operation of Kharkov. I think that's probably true, but I would say that the fact that Kharkov has a population of around 1 million doesn't, to my mind, mean that the Russians would not be able to storm Kharkov. It bears repeating again that towns like Mariupol had a population of around 450,000 before the war began, and the Russians were able to storm it. A town like the Severodonetsk, Lysychansk conurbation had a population of around 350,000. We've seen that opposite Donetsk city, the Russians are able to crack very heavy Ukrainian defenses. I doubt that the Russians would just, send thousands of troops pouring into Kharkov from all directions. It wouldn't be like the storming of Berlin, perhaps, because the Russians haven't deployed that number of troops to Kharkov to do that. But I can imagine repeating the pattern of events in Donbass, that the Russians would take one sector of Kharkov at a time. Ukrainian troops would be obliged to expend their ammunition trying to hold out in Kharkov, but they would lose gradually more and more of their troops as they found resupply difficult and perhaps eventually impossible. And eventually one could see how the Russians could capture Kharkov incrementally in that way. So anyway, the point is that it does look increasingly as if the Russians are making the first moves towards capturing Kharkov. And we've seen that there are now growing signs that the Russians are going to start something at some point in southwestern Ukraine as well. And this is, of course, the place where the famous Ukrainian counteroffensive was supposed to happen, the one that was going to retake Kherson city. And I spoke in my previous video about how even the Western media is now losing hope about that counteroffensive, and I referred to articles which have appeared in the Washington Post and in the London Review of Books. And there has now been, by the way, an article in The Economist, the British current affairs magazine, which takes an staunchly anti-Putin, anti-Russian government line to a degree which I personally find disturbing for various reasons. I find it so extreme in its anti-Putin positions, and I've had some real concerns about some of the covers, for example, that The Economist has published, which to my mind are deeply disturbing. But anyway, let's not get sidetracked with that. The Economist itself has also now published an article which casts doubt upon the Ukrainian military's ability to carry out an offensive in Kherson region. So it's increasingly looking as if in southwestern Ukraine, where the Russians have apparently concentrated around 30 battalion tactical groups, mainly airborne forces, by the way, also one hears, and apparently they have another 15 battalion groups in Zaporozhye as well. Anyway, one way or the other, it looks as if the Russians might be planning something there too. I personally think it is inevitable that sooner or later the Russians will want to capture Zaporozhye and Nikolaev and probably Kryvyi Rog, and eventually will want to take Odessa. Though, again, I don't want to discuss timelines, at least not in this video. And I would add that we're getting all these reports that volunteers are now being recruited, enlisted and trained in Russia in various new brigades that the Russian military has apparently been building up ever since March. Now, bear in mind, March to September would be about a 6-month training period, about what you would need to get troops up to a reasonable standard of training and equipped with proper weapons, and these would probably be reservists anyway, people who've already had some degree of military experience. We're not talking about, the rushed training that so many Ukrainian troops have been experiencing. So there's 18 brigades apparently earmarked for southwest Ukraine, including the ODYSEE brigade that I was talking about some time ago. So a major reinforcement of Russian forces in southwestern Ukraine may be on its way, and that also points to likely Russian offensive operations there. So it's looking extremely bleak for Ukraine. And by the way, there are reports that the Ukrainians are now being pushed into trying to shuttle their troops from one collapsing front line to another. I saw reports yesterday that there are major delays now in the Ukrainian railway system for civilian travellers, and that points to troop trains being moved around from one front to another as Ukraine desperately tries to fill the gaps, to hold together, reinforce collapsing front lines. Far from Ukraine having enough troops to hold out, it's actually running short of troops that it can send to its various front lines as they start to crack. And by the way, a German journalist who I believe writes for Bild Zeitung, who many people know as Julian, has recently tweeted that claims that the Russian army is running out of steam are self-evidently wrong, and that Ukraine needs an army not of 500,000 men, which supposedly is what it has, or 1 million men if you believe some of the more extreme claims that some Ukrainian officials have said, that it needs 5 million men in order to withstand all of this Russian pressure. Well, that is, of course, a fantastic number. There is no conceivable way that Ukraine could put together a force of 5 million men and could equip it to the necessary levels. And a Ukrainian journalist writing for Ukrainian Forbes has also repeated a point which I've been making for some time, which is that the peak of Western arms deliveries to Ukraine was April-May. Since then, Western arms deliveries to Ukraine have started to dwindle. And there's been an awful lot made about the latest $1 billion provision of weapon systems to Ukraine that the United States has made. But of course, the striking thing about this is that it was almost entirely made up. It was entirely made up of two items, either of medical supplies, which, by the way, much needed, and nobody should criticize the supply of medical supplies, but also ammunition for existing supplied systems. In other words, no more HIMARS launchers, despite the fact that we have good reasons to believe that the Russians have destroyed many HIMARS launchers. No more M777 howitzers. No tanks, obviously. No helicopters, interestingly. The United States has supplied Ukraine with large numbers of Mi-17 Russian-built helicopters, originally earmarked for the Afghan army, which collapsed last year. Well, there's not been more deliveries of helicopters of that nature for some time. Slovakia has recently announced that it's supplying 11 MiG-29 fighter jets to Ukraine. I think that is that is a misleading claim. And the reason I think it's misleading is because I think that Slovakia actually supplied these MiG-29 fighter jets to Ukraine some time ago. I think that this is basically Slovakia publicly announcing a delivery of those MiG-29s, which has already happened. And I suspect that Ukraine has actually received MiG fighter jets, MiG-29, Soviet-era MiG-29 fighter jets from Ukraine, from Slovakia and probably Poland, but it just hasn't been announced publicly. And in fact, the Ukrainian Air Force, despite undoubtedly having been reinforced with fighter jets from Bulgaria, Slovakia and Poland, has not been performing many active operations for some time. And we also getting reports, and they seem to be confirmed reports, that last week was one of the heaviest weeks of Ukrainian losses for the entire period of the war. There's been periods when Ukraine has lost more men, and sometimes periods when it's been losing fewer men. But apparently last week was one of the bloodiest for Ukraine for the duration of the war. It is apparently, according to some reports, lost men at a similar level to its losses during the worst of the fighting in Mariupol and for the Severodonetsk, Lysychansk conurbation. So it's a very bleak picture for Ukraine, and I think that this partly explains events like the shelling of the nuclear power station at Zaporozhye and of the dam across Novaya Kharkova. Now, by the way, I've looked at this dam. As I've said, it's a Stalin-era construction. I am skeptical, deeply skeptical, that the railway bridge has been significantly damaged, despite Ukrainian claims, which have been repeated by the British Defense Ministry. The Russians seem to deny that, but it does seem as if electricity generation by the dam has been reduced because some of the turbines have been damaged in the shelling. And I suspect that what we've probably seen Ukraine do is that as they've gradually come to realize that they're not going to be able to cut off Russian communications across the Dnieper River, and they're not going to be able, by destroying or damaging bridges, and that they're not going to be able to mount this counteroffensive towards Kherson region, that what they're proposing to do instead, or what they're trying to do instead, is trying to create problems and electricity shortages for the Russians, and perhaps crisis situations for the Russians by attacking these facilities. I think that is a hopeless idea. Now, they can damage the dam. I doubt that they can destroy it with the kind of HIMARS systems that they possess. The missiles that they have are too small, and I think they can't do significant damage to the dam. They've not even succeeded in knocking down the Antonovsky Bridge near Kherson, and I can't imagine that they would do really serious damage to this dam, which is a huge Stalin-era construction. I have also read a Russian report, admittedly it is a Russian report, about the Zaporozhye power station, nuclear power station. And as I suspected, this is a massively over-engineered Soviet-era construction. Again, the kind of shelling of this power station that's taking place is not going to do significant damage to it. It's certainly not going to damage the reactors or the nuclear waste units or any of those things. It could do some damage to some of the facilities, but the Russians seem confident that any damage to the reactor can be contained. So, I doubt that these attacks are going to achieve anything meaningful. And on top of that, we're hearing of serious problems in the Ukrainian economy. Apparently 60% of spending by Ukraine is now on the war. Tax revenue has collapsed, and funding from the West is not able to make the difference. All of which points increasingly to an inflationary crisis, perhaps even a hyperinflationary crisis in Ukraine, perhaps as winter approaches. So, coming back to that original point that I made at the start of this program, what are the war aims here? Wars of attrition, historically, make the victor stronger. They don't make the victor weaker. They are disastrous for the loser. At the end of this war, we could see an outcome not so very different to what we saw with the Confederacy of the southern states in the war that was fought on the territory of the United States in the 1860s. We could see its total collapse, Ukraine's total collapse, just as the Confederacy collapsed and was absorbed by the victorious Union. And of course there were many people who were predicting huge resistance to the United States in the southern states. That never really materialized, and I'm going to make a prediction the same will happen in Ukraine if, after this war of attrition, Russia wins. Because wars of attrition are massively demoralizing to the loser. The loser has used all his strength and all his energy, used all his resources, all his emotional and physical reserves to try to achieve victory, and still loses. Then a mood sets in that victory against the winner is somehow impossible and can never be achieved. Whereas, of course, the winner becomes more confident and gains, as I said, in strength. So this isn't helping Ukraine. And on top of all of that, we have this enormous crisis now in the West. And I'm going to focus again on Europe because the economic crisis is going to affect the United States. The dip in petrol prices that has caused so much encouragement to the Biden administration in the United States, I suspect is going to prove unsustainable. And I'm going to fully expect fuel prices in the United States to start rising again as winter closes in. But put that aside for the moment. In Europe, we now see the energy regulators saying that Germany must reduce its energy use by 20% if it's to get through the winter. In Britain, we are seeing the government preparing for blackouts. And just as in Germany, fantastic ideas are being peddled. Liquefied natural gas is going to provide all the solutions to all these problems. Taking fewer showers is going to help Germany get through the winter. So in Britain, we're now starting to see the same thing. And I am referring now to the Labour leader, Keir Starmer's extraordinary proposal that the government freeze energy prices for consumers. Now, the history of trying to freeze energy prices in a period of exploding prices, and remember, it isn't just energy prices, it's all prices are now rising, is that this creates massive imbalances and distortions. It creates a whole network of subsidies and cross subsidies, and eventually it can actually create shortages. I think this is a disastrous idea. It shows again how Western leaders, rather than address the problems, are resorting to magical thinking. In Keir Starmer's case, this is a reckless proposal, obviously done for short-term, to address short-term political needs. It's far more radical and extreme, by the way, than anything that his much maligned predecessor, Jeremy Corbyn, ever suggested. Government intervention on a wild and bizarre level, and it's not going to work. But it's another indicator of how bad economically the situation is. And we have now had Henry Kissinger, that old war horse, that person who many people, myself included by the way, feel should have been tried for war crimes all those years ago over some of the things that he did in the 1970s. Well, whatever Kissinger is, he is a realist, even if a deeply cynical one, and nobody ever said that Kissinger was any kind of fool. And he's now published, or he's now given an interview in which he laments the disastrous position, essentially, that the United States is in geopolitically, that it's got tensions ongoing with both China and Russia simultaneously. His work of the 1970s in breaking the link between those two, realigning China with the United States against the Soviet Union, that's all been undone. He's deeply worried about the escalation of global tensions. He's worried about the possibilities of war between the United States and these two superpowers. So, come back to this question. What are our war aims? War aims that are defined as weakening Russia, but which will probably, most likely, end up making Russia stronger, and instead of erasing Russia as a geopolitical rival, are uniting what will likely be a stronger Russia with an angry China against the United States. None of this makes any kind of sense to me. Now, I have wanted to see this war end first and foremost because of the horrific damage that this war is doing. The price in lives in Ukraine, the destruction of many young lives and not so young lives in Ukraine, this obliteration of Ukraine that seems to me to be happening at an accelerating speed now. But let's assume that you are more like Kissinger, that you're a cold-blooded, hard-hearted, calculating, ruthless, cynical realist of the Kissinger school. Even to you, none of this makes any kind of sense anymore. Why then continue with this war? Kissinger previously said a few weeks ago that the West has 2 months to turn this thing round. Those 2 months are now up. We're nowhere close to achieving any kind of victory in Ukraine. All the indications are that we're heading with Ukraine to a major military defeat there. What is our plan? How do we get out of this? What is our off-ramp? Well, I don't think we have one. I don't think the political leaders in the West have any kind of plan at all. That's why we see crazy plans like those of Robert Habeck and now Keir Starmer floating around, people coming up with ideas which aren't really ideas, they're just empty rhetoric, things that fool people for a time, but which don't address the underlying problems. I'm afraid that isn't going to do. Sooner or later, we're going to have to talk. We're going to have to talk to the Russians. We're probably going to have to talk with the Chinese. We're going to have to come up with some kind of solution to these problems. But at what price? and in what state, and what will be the demands that we face then. It's either that, either do the deal now or postpone it until, as I said before, Moscow and possibly Beijing, but certainly Moscow, at least in Europe, dictate terms. And of course the risk is that rather than accept even that, we have more and more lunatic suggestions, like the one in that really terrifyingly bizarre article by Simon Tisdall in The Guardian that I discussed yesterday. Sometimes, if the choices are all bad, one has to choose the least bad one. It seems to me we are there now. And the quicker in the West, in Western capitals, we face up to that, the better for us and Ukraine it will be. But I see no sign of that kind of realism at the moment. And I wonder how long it will be and how much damage there will be done before I do. Well, thank you for joining me for this program today. Remember, you can find us on other platforms, Locals and Rumble, but also, of course, Telegram and ODYSEE. And you can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar. Remember also to go to our shop. You can buy all our amazing things there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our sweatshirts, our t-shirts, and all the rest. And also, please remember to press the like button if you've liked this video and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today, and I look forward to hearing from you joining me again soon. And have a very good day until then.